Listen, I know. I'm a hoot owl. And I need to... That's a me problem, not a you problem. But my husband got me watching this movie, Gangs of New York or whatnot, and I was sitting there, and the entire time I was thinking, past is prologue, and I just got sucked into it. But so anyway, tonight it is lesson 5, guided reading, and we are on. Okay, so anyway, so tonight is lesson 5, guided reading, and we're going over the new Jim Crow. And even though we are on lesson 5, we are on part 3 of chapter 1. I'm using Teaching Tolerance's Guide to the New Jim Crow, and the author, Michelle Alexander, worked with Teaching Tolerance to develop this plan. This is a really long thing, and I try and keep them under 30 minutes, like what a class period would be, so I'm probably going to have to upload another video that's kind of like talking discussion-wise, which, if you like this and you're down for it, then definitely comment, and then I'll do the questions that you need to, the guided questions. Where are they? Right here. The guided questions, with y'all. Just comment what time would work for y'all. Because if I'm going to have people here talking and engaging, well then, definitely. So, let me see. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I give you the vocabulary and the endnotes for this lesson in the comments of this video, in case you are questioning anything or you want to look something up. If you want to get the guided reading that I'm going over, this exact thing, then go to my website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, and it's lesson 5, and it's highlighted, the guided reading, mass incarceration as a form of racialized social control. And there's a link, there should be a link above somewhere for that. And then, let me see. Where am I? Oh, here I am. Okay. So I'm going to comment, and now I'm going to give you the endnotes and the vocabulary, and the guided reading link, and the link to the study guide. Let me see. Did that work out? Let me see. Just making sure. Give me 1 second. Woohoo. Well, there's the endnotes. There's the endnotes. There's one. And then, let's see. Oh, where is my... Oh no, I've lost them. Oh no, here they are. Copy, or the links to the guided reading and the study questions are right there. And then also, let's go ahead and post the vocabulary for tonight. And on my website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, there is a tab that says glossary, and every time that we add new words, I go and I automatically add that to the glossary. So all the previous terms from previous lessons are in my glossary on the website. Vocabulary. Okay. In order to keep this under 30 minutes, I'm going to plow through this guided reading, because this is the fun parts that you're supposed to pay attention to. And then, if you're interested, tell me what time works out for you in the comments, and we will go over the study questions together and discuss them, because that's what we're here for. Chapter 1. Oh, and if you want the entire chapter, go to my website because I had the audio version. So you don't have to buy the book. Just go and listen to the author read you the first entire chapter. This is the important parts that's not almost 2 hours long. The rebirth of caste. The birth of mass incarceration. The rhetoric of law and order was first mobilized in the late 1950s as Southern governors and law enforcement officials attempted to generate and mobilize white opposition to the civil rights movement. In the years following Brown versus Board of Education, civil rights activists used direct action tactics in an effort to force reluctant Southern states to desegregate public facilities. Southern governors and law enforcement officials often characterized these tactics as criminal and argued that the rise of the civil rights movement was indicative of a breakdown of law and order. Now, this book, I do believe, was written in 2010. I could be wrong, and I might need to go back and fix that, but this thing was written, copyright 2010 through 2012 by Michelle Alexander. So, think about, this is only just a couple years ago, and think about the time period right now, and think about what's happening and what has happened thus far as I'm reading. For more than a decade, from the mid-1950s until the late 1960s, conservatives systematically and strategically linked opposition to civil rights legislation to calls for law and order, arguing that Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of civil disobedience was the leading cause of crime. Civil rights protests were frequently depicted as criminal rather than political in nature, and federal courts were accused of excessive lenience toward lawlessness, thereby contributing to the spread of crime. So, I'm thinking, me personally, Charlottesville, Standing Rock, Ferguson, that's just me. Moving on with the text. Unfortunately, at the same time that civil rights were being identified as a threat to law and order, the FBI was reporting fairly dramatic increases in the national crime rate. Beginning in the 1960s, crime rates rose in the United States for a period for about 10 years. The reasons for the crime wave are complex, but can be explained in a large part by the rise of the baby boom generation. The spike in the number of young men in the 15 to 24 age group, which historically had been responsible for the most crimes. The surge of young men in the population was occurring at precisely the same time that unemployment rates for black men were rising sharply, but the economic and demographic factors contributing to rising crime were not explored in the media. Instead, crime reports were sensationalized and offered as further evidence to break down in lawfulness, morality, and social stability in the wake of the civil rights movement. My mouth is dry. We're going over Teaching Tolerance, Guide to the New Jim Crow. This is chapter 1, part 3, but lesson number 5. You can go to my blog and get caught up at www.southernfriedsocialist.com. To make matters worse, riots erupted in the summer of 1964 in Harlem and Rochester, followed by a series of uprisings that swept the nation following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The racial imagery associated with the riots gave fuel to the argument that civil rights for blacks led to rampant crime. Civil rights activists who argued that the uprisings were directly related to widespread police harassment and abuse were dismissed by conservatives as out of hand. That kind of sounds like a past prologue-ish. While many civil rights advocates in this period actively resisted the attempt by conservatives to use rising crime as an excuse to crack down on impoverished black communities, some black activists began to join the calls for law and order and express support for harsh response to lawbreakers. Wittingly or unwittingly, they found themselves complicit in the emergence of a penal system unprecedented in world history. Black support for harsh responses to urban crime, support born of desperation and legitimate concern over the unraveling of basic security in inner-city communities, helped provide political cover for conservatives for conservative politicians who saw an opening to turn back the clock on racial progress in the United States. Conservatives could point to black support for highly punitive approaches to dealing with problems of the urban poor as proof that race had nothing to do with their law and order agenda. We call that pandering now. And there was a lot of it at the DNC. Early on, little effort was made to disguise. I have a child and I think he's running around. I'll see. Early on, little effort was made to disguise the racial motivations behind the law and order rhetoric and the harsh criminal justice legislation proposed in Congress. The most ardent opponents of civil rights legislation and desegregation were the most active on the emerging crime issue. As the rules of acceptable discourse changed, however, segregationists distanced themselves from an explicitly racist agenda. They developed instead a racially sanitized rhetoric of cracking down on crime, rhetoric that is now used freely by politicians of every stripe. Conservative politicians who embraced this rhetoric purposely failed to distinguish between the direct action tactics of civil rights activists, violent rebellions in inner cities, and traditional crimes of an economic or violent nature. Although law and order rhetoric ultimately failed to prevent the formal dismantling of the Jim Crow system, it proved highly effective in appealing to poor and working-class whites, particularly in the South, who were opposed to integration and frustrated by the Democratic Party's apparent support for the civil rights movement. I know everything was topsy-turvy back then, wasn't it? Now it just flopped right back around. Life's a circle. Sorry, going back to the text. In fact, law and order rhetoric, first employed by segregationists, would eventually contribute to a major realignment of political parties in the United States. The success of law and order rhetoric among working-class whites and the intense resentment of racial reforms, particularly in the South, led conservative Republican analysis to believe that a new majority, listen to this part, y'all, I'm telling you what, this book was written in 2010 by Michelle Alexander, and it's called The New Jim Crow, and it sounds like last year. Let me start this paragraph over. And we're talking back in the day. She's going over history right now. The success of law and order rhetoric among working-class whites and the intense resentment of racial reforms, particularly in the South, led conservative Republican analysts to believe that a new majority could be created by the Republican Party, one that included the traditional Republican base, the white South, and the half-Catholic, blue-collar voters of the big cities. Some conservative political strategists admitted that appealing to racial fears and antagonisms was central to this strategy, though it had to be done surreptitiously. Not superstitiously. Surreptitiously. Listen, I'm from the South, y'all. Deep South. surreptitiously. We learned a new word. I'll put that on the dictionary. Republican strategist Kevin Phillips is often credited for offering the most influential argument in favor of a race-based strategy for Republican political dominance in the South. He argued in The Emerging Republican Majority, published in 1969, that Nixon's successful presidential election campaign could point the way towards long-term political realignment and the building of a new Republican majority if Republicans continued to campaign primarily on the basis of racial issues, using coded anti-black rhetoric. He argued that Southern white Democrats had become so angered and alienated by the Democratic Party's support for civil rights reforms, such as desegregation and busing, that those voters could be easily persuaded to switch parties if those racial resentments could be maintained. Thus, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, two schools of thought were offered to the general public regarding race, poverty, and the social order. Conservatives argued that poverty was caused not by structural factors related to race and class, but rather by cultural, particularly black culture. So that's where you get into like all these people basically saying like all those racist things. Like when Oh, Hillary Clinton was talking about when we see somebody in a hoodie coming and we're scared. That was a racial, and we went over this in the last lesson where it was actually dated back to a time before. So give me just 1 minute. I am sharing this. Give me one moment. Give me one moment. And then I will go right back to reading the text. I'm trying to make sure that people see this because I've started a brand new blog, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, and I am trying to get the word out, and that's why I'm kind of zipping through these lessons, because I always have the lesson directly after this up on my website beforehand. That way you can get all the printouts before we do the live. That way if somebody wants to say, hey, I want to participate, or I've got stuff I want to talk about in the thing, that we can totally do that. You know what I'm talking about. So my husband's like asleep, and I just asked that question and he answered me. Oh, okay. I've got one more, and then I swear I'm going to go back to the reading. Let's see. I want to share it to my timeline. Yes, I do. And I completely know it's late. I know that it's late. I'm a hoot owl, and that goes back to my previous statement about, like, I'm trying to plow through these lessons, but, I mean, why not? I mean, if a conversation can be had, then why not? And then maybe, like, one more group. What group do you think I should do? What group do you think would... Because I know that, like, I have a lot of political friends, but I'm not exactly going for them because I know that they know what I'm talking about. So it's kind of more of, like, I'm going for all their, you know, like, they don't want to have that weird conversation with their uncle. They want somebody else to. So I thought, well, the new Jim Crow would knock out a bunch of stereotypes right off the bat that they use in the South, particularly from where I'm from. So... give me 1 second. I can't get anything to work. There we go. Might as well. Who cares? That might work out. Who knows who will be up. I'll cast that cosmic line out. Okay, anyway, moving on. Thus, in the late 19th... we're doing the teaching tolerance lesson plan to the new Jim Crow. So, and we are on lesson 5. And we're in the guided reading, and it's a rather long reading, so I'm going to try and go through it. But if you want the questions to the guided reading, or the guided reading that we're going over right now, or the entire audio, go to my website and you'll have access to all that. And if you're interested in coming back and doing like a whole, like, let's all discuss the question and answer guide, then I'm totally down for that. Just write down what time would be good for you. So anyway, thus, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, 2 schools of thought were offered to the general public regarding race, poverty, and the social order. Conservatives argued that poverty was caused not by structural factors related to race and class, but rather by culture, particularly black culture. Liberals, by contrast, insisted that social reforms such as the war on poverty and civil rights legislation would get to the root causes of criminal behavior and stress the social conditions that predictably generate crime. Competing images of the poor as deserving and undeserving became a central component to the debate. Ultimately, the racialized nature of this imagery became a crucial resource for conservatives, who succeeded in using law and order rhetoric in their effort to mobilize the resentment of white working class voters, many of whom felt threatened by the sudden progress of African Americans. As explained by Thomas and Mary Edsel, EDSALL. In their insightful book, Chain Reaction, a disproportionate share of the cost of integration and racial equality had been borne by lower and lower middle-class whites, who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms with blacks for jobs and status who lived in neighborhoods adjoining black ghettos. Their children, not the children of wealthy whites, attended schools most likely to fall under busing orders. This reality made it possible for conservatives to characterize the liberal democratic establishment as being out of touch with ordinary working people. Oh, how the tides have turned. And then flopped back again. By 1968, 81% of those responding to the Gallup poll agreed with the statement that the law and order has broken down in this country, and the majority blamed Negroes who start riots and communists. Race had become yet again a powerful wedge, breaking up what had been a solid liberal coalition based on economic interest of the poor and the working and the lower middle classes. In the 1968 election, race eclipsed class and the organizing principle of American politics, and by 1972, attitudes on racial issues rather than socio-economic status were the primary determinant of voters' political self-identification. Just as race had been used at the turn of the century by the Southern elites to rupture class solidarity at the bottom of the income ladder. Race as a national issue had broke up the Democratic New Deal bottom-up coalition, a coalition dependent on the substantial support from all voters, white and black, at or below the median income. The conservative revolution that took root within the Republican Party in the 1960s did not reach its full development until the election in 1980. In his campaign for presidency, Reagan built on the success of earlier conservatives who developed a strategy for exploiting racial hostility or resentment for political gain without making explicit reference to race, condemning welfare queens and criminal predators into office with the strong support of disaffected whites. Poor and working class whites who felt betrayed by the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights agenda, his colorblind rhetoric on crime, welfare, taxes, and states' rights was clearly understood by white and black voters as having racial dimension, though claims to that effect were impossible to prove. In October 1982, President Reagan officially announced his administration's war on drugs. At the time he declared this new war, less than 2% of the American public viewed drugs as the most important issue facing the nation. This fact was no deterrent to Reagan, for the drug war from the outset had little to do with public concern about drugs and much to do with public concern about race. By waging a war on drug users, the dealers, Reagan made good on his promise to crack down on the racially defined others, the undeserving. Practically overnight, the budgets of federal law enforcement agencies soared. Between 1980 and 1984, FBI anti-drug funding increased from $8 million to $95 million. Department of Defense anti-drug allocations increased from $33 million in 1981 to $1,042 million in 1991. During the same period, DEA anti-drug spending grew from $86 to $1,026 million, and the FBI anti-drug allocations grew from $38 to $181 million. By contrast, funding for agencies responsible for drug treatment, prevention, education was dramatically reduced. The budget of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, for example, was reduced from $274 million to $57 million from 1981 to 1984. The anti-drug funds allocated to the Department of Education were cut from $14 million to $3 million. Why is everybody always cutting education? Determined to ensure that the new Republican majority would continue to support the extraordinary expansion of the federal government's law enforcement activities, and that Congress would continue to fund it, the Reagan administration launched a media offensive to justify the war on drugs. Does that sound familiar? I wonder if they do that today. Central to the media campaign was an effort to sensationalize the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city neighborhoods, communities devastated by deindustrialization and skyrocketing unemployment. The media frenzy the campaign inspired simply could not have come at a worse time for African Americans. In the early 1980s, just as the drug war was kicking off, inner city communities were suffering from economic collapse. The blue-collar factory jobs that had been plentiful in urban areas in the 1950s and the 1960s had suddenly disappeared. The new manufacturing jobs that opened during this time period were generally located in the suburbs. The growing spatial mismatch of jobs had a profound impact on African Americans trapped in ghettos. The decline in legitimate employment opportunities among inner city residents increased incentives to sell drugs, most notably crack cocaine. Crack hit the streets in 1985, a few years after Reagan's drug war was announced, leading to a spike in violence as drug markets struggled to stabilize, and the anger and frustration associated with joblessness boiled. Joblessness and crack swept inner cities precisely at the moment that a fierce backlash against the civil rights movement was manifesting itself through the war on drugs. Numerous paths were available to us as a nation in the wake of the crack crisis, yet for reasons traceably largely to racial politics and fear-mongering, we chose war. Conservatives found that they could finally justify an all-out war on the enemy that had been racially defined years before. Almost immediately after crack appeared, the Reagan administration leaped at the opportunity to publicize crack cocaine in an effort to build support for its drug war. The strategy bore fruit. In June 1986, Newsweek declared crack to be the biggest story since Vietnam/Watergate, and in August of that year, Time magazine termed crack the issue of the year. Thousands of stories about crack crises flooded the airways and the newsstands, and the stories had a clear racial subtext. The articles typically featured black crack whores, crack babies, and gangbangers, reinforcing already prevalent racial stereotypes of black women as irresponsible, selfish welfare queens, and black men as predators, part of an inferior and criminal subculture. In September 1986, with the media frenzy at full throttle, the House passed legislation that allocated $2 billion to the anti-drug crusade, requiring the participation of the military in narcotics control efforts, allowed the death penalty for some drug-related crimes, and authorized the admission of some illegally obtained evidence in drug trials. Later that month, the Senate proposed give me a second. The Senate proposed even tougher anti-drug legislation, and shortly thereafter the President signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 into law. Among other harsh penalties, the legislation included mandatory minimum sentencing for the distribution of cocaine, including far more severe punishment for distribution of crack associated with blacks than powder cocaine associated with whites. So, like, if you were on crack, it was usually because you were black, and it was, like, basically is what it's saying. And it was, you know, like, if you're white and you're just doing some cocaine in the bathroom, you're having an off night. I guess. Going back to the text. Congress revisited drug policy in 1988. The new Anti-Drug Abuse Act authorized public housing authorities to evict any tenant who allows any form of drug-related criminal activity to occur on or near public housing premises, and eliminated many federal benefits, including student loans, for anyone convicted of a drug offense. The act also expanded use of the drug penalty for serious drug-related offenses and imposed new mandatory minimums for drug offenses, including a 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of cocaine base, with no evidence of intent to sell. Remarkably, the penalty would apply to first-time offenders. The severity of this punishment was unprecedented in the federal system. Until 1988, 1 year of imprisonment had been the maximum for possession of any amount of any drug. Reagan's successor, President George H.W. Bush, did not hesitate to employ implicit racial appeals. Having learned from the success of other conservative politicians that subtle negative references to race could mobilize poor and working-class whites who once were loyal to the Democratic Party, Bush's most famous racial appeal, the Willie Horton Ad, released during 1988 presidential campaign, featured a dark-skinned black man, a convicted murderer, who escaped while on a work furlough and then raped and murdered a white woman in her home. The ad blamed Bush's opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, after the death of the white woman, because he approved the furlough program. For months, the ad played repeatedly on network news stations and was the subject of incessant political commentary. Though controversial, the ad was stunningly effective. It also destroyed Dukakis' chances of ever becoming president. Now, let's take a moment. This book was written in 2010. There was just textbook political play right there, and how to destroy someone's character and how you play games. And it wasn't there emails and other emails and meetings, and from all sides except for that one. But anyway, once in the Oval Office, Bush stayed on message, opposing affirmative action, the aggressive civil rights enforcement, and embracing the drug war with great enthusiasm. By the late 1980s, not only conservatives played leading roles in the Get Tough movement, spouting the rhetoric once associated only with segregationists, Democratic politicians and policymakers were now attempting to wrest control of the crime and drug issues from Republicans by advocating stricter anti-crime and anti-drug laws, all in an effort to win back the so-called swing voters who were defecting to the Republican Party. In the early 1990s, resistance to the emergence of a new system of racialized social control collapsed across the political spectrum. A new racial caste system, mass incarceration, was taking hold, as politicians of every stripe competed with each other to win the votes of poor and working-class whites, whose economic status was precarious at best, and who felt threatened by racial reforms. The results were immediate. As law enforcement budgets exploded, so did prison and jail populations. In 1991, the Sentencing Project reported that the number of people behind the bars in the United States was unprecedented in world history, and that 1/4 of young African American men were now under the control of the criminal justice system. Pause right here. Go back a few lessons if you need to figure out what all they really lost, both in and out of prison, because of that. 1 in 4. 1 in 4. 1 in 4. To the contrary, man, I'm telling you, that just messed me up. I got lost. To the contrary, in 1992, presidential candidate... Ooh, I'm glad it got lost because now I can really focus on this part. Let's listen. We're going over Teaching Tolerance's lesson plan to the new Jim Crow. We're on lesson 5, page 6 of the guided reading. Paragraph 6. Once elected, Clinton endorsed the idea of federal three-strikes you're out law, which he advocated in his 1994 State of the Union address to enthusiastic applause on both sides of the aisle. The $30 billion crime bill sent to President Clinton in August 1994 was hailed as a victory for the Democrats, who were able to wrest the crime issue away from the Republicans and make it their own. The bill created dozens of new federal capital crimes, mandated life sentences for some 3-time offenders, and authorized more than $16 billion for state prison grants and expansion of state and local police forces. Far beyond resisting the emergence of the new caste system, Clinton escalated the drug war beyond what conservatives had imagined possible a decade earlier. As the Justice Policy Institute had observed, the Clinton administration's tough-on-crime policies resulted in the largest increases in federal and state prison inmates than any other president in American history. That's footnote number 15 included, both on the blog and in the comments. Clinton eventually moved beyond crime and catapulted into, encapsulated Sorry, I thought my kid was up. To the conservative racial agenda of welfare. This move, like his get tough rhetoric and policies, was part of the grand strategy articulated by the New Democrats to appeal to the elusive white swing voters. In so doing, Clinton, more than any other president, created the current racial undercast. He signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which ended welfare as we know it, replacing aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, with block grants to states called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. TANF imposed a 5-year lifetime limit on welfare assistance, as well as a permanent lifetime ban on eligibility for welfare and food stamps for anyone convicted of felony drug offense, including simple possession of marijuana. So, how many white girls got pregnant as a teenager? You know, all you white parents out there, you know that you, especially older white parents with teenage daughters, you know that she snuck something home one time, and you just didn't even think about it. And there's somebody's kid that got caught one time and his life is ruined. Determined to prove how tough he could be on them, Clinton also made it easier for federally assisted public housing projects to exclude anyone with a criminal history, an extraordinarily harsh step up in the midst of a drug war aimed at racial and ethnic minorities. The law and order perspective, first introduced during the peak of the civil rights movement by rabid segregationists, had become nearly hegemonic 2 decades later. Once again, in response to a major disruption in the prevailing racial order, this time the civil rights gains of the 1960s, a new system of racialized social control was created by exploiting the vulnerabilities and racial resentments of poor and working class whites. More than 2 million people found themselves behind bars at the turn of the 21st century, and millions more were relegated to the margins of mainstream society, banished to a political and social space not unlike Jim Crow, where discrimination in employment, housing, and access to education was perfectly legal, and where they could be denied the right to vote. 90% of those admitted to prison for drug offenses in many states were black or Latino, yet the mass incarceration of communities of color was explained in race-neutral terms, and an adaptation to the needs and demands of the current political climate. The new Jim Crow was born. When I read that one part where it is saying, It was more regulated to the margins of mainstream society, banished to a political and social space, not unlike Jim Crow, where discrimination in employment, housing, and access to education was perfectly legal. They're saying that now it's illegal to do that. Okay, well, but you cannot refute the evidence or on studies that have shown that if an employer, 50-50, like exact same resumes, exact same people, if they had a white name they got called back, if there's a certain, I'll bring it up, I'll publish, I'll figure it out and I'll post it on the website. But like, you cannot help that people's implicit bias that has permeated their thinking process due to the racist foundation that our country is built on has automatically made them go, oh, well, I only want to see if Tiffany and Brittany want to work here. Like, no. So, anyway, this has gone a little bit overboard. That is the guided reading. You can get the guided reading on the website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com. This is lesson 5. I was just kind of making some points. I would also really check out the Clintons. Really check them out. Like, people always bugged me about why I wouldn't vote for Clinton. I just don't think that you can come back from saying bring them to heel. I just don't think that I could say something that hateful about somebody's child and it be that racially charged and them just expect me to expect myself to be invited back over to their house for dinner. That makes no sense. Why would they trust me again? I'm obviously ignorant. And then even if you try, and then you stick your foot right back in your mouth. Oh, anyway, I'm ranting now. But so, guided reading, lesson 5 is done. Lesson 6 is tomorrow. I'm trying to get through these lessons. That way I can go ahead and have them up. There's only 10. So anyway, thank you. Have a good one. We'll do the questions later. They're on the website.